Yeah, my name is Sarah Sellars, and my colleague, Dr. Tong Wang. Today we're going to be talking about agricultural carbon markets. So I'm going to focus more on the policy side, and then Tong's going to share the results from her recently published paper, which has been really exciting and really useful information for all of us working in this carbon market space. And I think a few of you weren't on yet. We mentioned Heather's traveling, so I think she had some problems with the internet outage and the flights, so she's not going to be able to be here to host. We really miss her today. She's a great host, but Mom and I will manage as best we can. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So today I'm going to be giving a presentation on agricultural carbon markets with a policy focus. My name is Sarah Sellars. I'm assistant professor and extension specialist in sustainable farm and food systems here in the Ness School of Management and Economics. So I want to give a little bit of background on some of my work on agricultural carbon markets. So started working on this topic in early 2021. So this topic kind of reemerged at the end of 2020 and beginning of 2021. We saw a lot of headlines kind of hitting the agricultural news about agricultural carbon programs. There was a lot of confusion, a lot of questions. So I started working to develop some information, mostly targeted towards farmers to help them navigate things. And then I also wrote some articles about policy, so kind of following the Growing Climate Solutions Act, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. And then I did some work studying Alberta, and they have an agricultural carbon market there. It's been working for over 20 years, so kind of seeing what they've done and how they've dealt with some of their challenges. And then after that, kind of working on programs, keeping people updated as the situation has evolved. So these are some of my articles and some of the presentations I've done. I think one of the most interesting presentations I did was the second one here, educating stakeholders on agricultural carbon market opportunities in the Midwestern US. So that was actually a virtual presentation I did in Indonesia to the international coconut community. So they were really interested in starting an agricultural carbon credit program there for coconuts. And while I know nothing about coconuts, they wanted to hear about our program here and kind of some of the lessons we've been learning from that. So that was kind of fun. But most of my work has been focused kind of on Midwestern farmers and helping them navigate and make decisions related to agricultural carbon opportunities. So this is what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to give a little background. I'm going to talk about supply and demand. We're going to talk about the policy and funding updates for all the latest information, and then we're going to wrap up. I want to start out by saying, please feel free to ask questions, jump in with questions. So I've traveled around a bit. I've presented this topic quite a few times at the university I was working at before. It was kind of where I started this program. So I traveled around Illinois presenting this to people, and I got a lot of questions. I heard a lot of opinions. A lot of people have strong opinions, which I appreciate. People had a lot to say, so please don't be shy. Please don't be afraid to ask questions and share your opinion, because I think it's really important we talk about all these things as we're trying to navigate this opportunity. And I also want to say, I'm not trying to tell you whether you should or shouldn't enroll. This is just a very neutral presentation, just trying to give you information to make decisions and learn more. So I'm not saying to go out and enroll the farming carbon credits tomorrow, just trying to give you information to navigate and make decisions. So let's start out with a little bit of background. So these are the emissions in million metric tons of carbon dioxide by sector. This is the latest data from the EPA, which is from 2022. So you can see the three major emitters are the transportation, electricity generation, and industry. Those account for pretty much almost 3/4 of the total emissions of the US. You can see agriculture is a smaller piece of that pie, accounting for 10% of the total emissions in the US. That could be a little bit bigger if some of the emissions from industry were moved to agriculture. So for example, nitrogen fertilizer production, all of the emissions for that are counted in industry, but most of the nitrogen fertilizer produced is used in agriculture, so that's not being counted in agriculture slice. And nitrogen fertilizer production is really energy intensive process of taking nitrogen out of the atmosphere and converting it into ammonia, and then doing further processes to convert it to urea or UAN, if those are the forms you want to apply. So it's really fascinating to me. I wrote an article about that too, if anyone's interested, how that actually works. And fascinating to me that nitrogen comes from the atmosphere. I mean, it's unlimited, which I think is really interesting. But again, part of that is energy intensive process. So while agriculture is also an emitter, it's also looked at as a sink for carbon dioxide. So we can store gases in trees, plants, and soils, so that carbon gets sequestered there. So agriculture is being looked at as part of the solution, as a way to sequester emissions through agricultural practices. So one of the advantages agriculture has over these other industries like transportation or electricity generation is its ability to change practices pretty quickly. So within 1 year, we can have farmers planting cover crops or changing their tillage practices, changing nitrogen application. But if we're thinking about reducing emissions in other industries in transportation or electricity generation, well, that's going to take some long-term infrastructure changes or new technologies. So that's the advantage agriculture has over some of these other industries. So with agricultural carbon credits, what we've seen are the results of two efforts simultaneously. So we've seen the government policy side. We've had congressional action, which was the passing of the Growing Climate Solutions Act. And we'll get into that a little more later. And then we've also seen some administrative activities. So we've seen the use of the Commodity Credit Corporation, or CCC, to fund programs, specifically the Climate Smart Commodities Program, which provides funding for research in climate smart commodities, and a piece of that would be these agricultural carbon credits. So we'll get into that a little more later too. And then we've seen some action on the industry side. So we've seen a lot of companies announcing and launching agricultural carbon credit programs. This kind of started hitting the news at the end of 2020, beginning of 2021. And then there's been a couple players who've been in this space for a long time, who've been generating and selling agricultural carbon credits too, that have kind of been brought back to the forefront. So these are the efforts we've seen. When this first became hitting part of the discussion in early 2021, there was a lot of talk about the USDA having its own carbon bank. So there were some people who thought that the USDA should be the one to manage and run a carbon bank instead of industry. But we've seen that discussion kind of dying down, and most of the focus has been on the industry programs and kind of working with those and solidifying those. So when I give this presentation, a lot of times I get the question, didn't we try this before already and it didn't work? So when people ask that, they're usually talking about the Chicago Climate Exchange. So this was a stock exchange that traded emissions and offsets projects. This started in the early 2000s and traded until 2010. And they had some protocols for agriculture. So some tillage, for example, they had a tillage protocol where you could change your tillage practices and participate in the stock exchange. And there were quite a few farmers that did get involved in this, but the market ended up collapsing at the end of 2010 due to inactivity. And when that trading stopped, carbon credits were somewhere between 5 and 10 cents. So it didn't work out. So you might be asking, well, why is this time any different than last time? So this is kind of my perspective on things. So there's some increased demand for carbon credits. There's been a lot of companies setting emissions reductions targets or net zero goals. There's been countries also setting these goals, and they've made some promises that they need to deliver on. And agricultural carbon credits are one piece of this bigger puzzle that can help these companies, set the goals they've either set for themselves or their shareholders have had them set. And also there's been a shift towards climate smart agriculture in policy. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but a lot of funding, a lot of projects, a lot of research. So I think that that could change things too. Again, I'm not saying that this means that agricultural carbon credits won't fail again, or that they couldn't evolve or change into something else. I definitely think that's possible. But I definitely think this discussion of climate smart commodities, or how we can kind of incorporate some of these practices we know have benefits, like cover crops or no tillage, trying to put a valuation on them. I don't think that discussion is going to be going away in the near future. So when this first emerged in early 2021, there were a couple surveys of farmers. A lot of them weren't aware of the opportunities for carbon markets, and there was a lot of confusion. People kind of call this the wild, wild west when it first came out, because there were so many programs. All of their kind of policies and protocols were different, of who could or couldn't enroll, or how many years you had to participate, or how they measured things. So there was a lot going on. So at the beginning of 2021, there was some survey work. Most of the farmers were saying that they needed more information from sources they could trust before they could make a decision. Very few had enrolled. A survey of 400 farmers at the beginning of 2021, only 1% had enrolled in programs. So I think Tong's going to talk about this a little more, so I'll just kind of touch on it briefly. But now we're a couple years into things. A recent survey suggested that there were 3% of the farmers surveyed were participating, so adoption has still been pretty low. And some of the USDA reports that have been released also kind of talk about that, so we'll get into that a little bit later. But what we've seen is more awareness, but still low enrollment. So probably you're wondering why people aren't participating. A lot of people say they're not willing to join if there aren't changes to the programs, and some are still taking kind of a wait and see approach to see what happens. And again, I think Tong's going to cover this a little more in depth, but I'll just briefly touch on the price. So the cost versus benefit of participating in the program seems to be something that's holding people back. Some of the participation requirements, definitely a lot of the programs don't allow early adopters to participate. So we had a lot of farmers that adopted no-till, or 20 years ago or 10 years ago, and we had people who adopted cover crops in the past too. And a lot of these programs don't allow the early adopters to participate because of the standards for counting the carbon sequestration. So if you're already doing the practice, it typically doesn't satisfy some of the principles that need to be satisfied for some of the verification programs of carbon credits. So that has been a really sore spot of these programs, is the early adopters who have been doing these practices for a really long time aren't eligible to participate. So I think there's still a lot of feelings about that, and just overall a lot of confusion, some confusion about the paperwork and requirements to enroll. There's a lot of data requirements and paperwork that needs to be done. So I think that does also hold some people back. But again, I'll let Tong get more into that discussion. And then I just briefly want to talk about the price of credits versus the cost, get into that a little more in depth. So currently, kind of an average of what programs are offering is somewhere between $15 and $30 per carbon credit. Well, you're probably wondering, what does that actually mean? So if we take that and we convert that to a per acre amount, that's somewhere between $1 and $34 per acre, typically is what companies are offering. So we know that there's costs with changing practices. With crop production, a lot of the programs are offering payments for either changing nitrogen practices, switching to reduced or no-till, or planting cover crops. So if we think about cover crops and we think about that kind of price range, well, it's probably not enough to cover some of complete adoption costs. So when people say that the cost is too low, we're probably at that point where it's still not covering the adoption costs for some of these practices. Another thing to mention is a lot of these companies require a software subscription. So To participate, you have to upload your data through the company's software subscription. So if you're already not subscribing to that, then that's additional costs you'd have to incur to participate, plus the time and energy of researching, talking to different companies and programs, making a decision about a program, and then going through all the paperwork and data uploading. You know, a lot of these programs require the uploading of previous data if you're not already doing that in their software. So that could take some work on the farmer end. When we look at stacking, that's when we reach maybe break even or making some return to your management investment on these participating in these programs. So maybe some of these programs allow stacking with some of the NRCS programs, and some don't. So when we look at stacking, that's when we reach a level that's maybe a little bit more interesting to producers. And those who are already thinking about adopting these practices, it may be logical to enroll if you're already considering, since we know some of the programs have some restrictions for how many years you have to have adopted the practice within. So if you're already thinking about adopting that, it may be logical to go ahead to meet some of those requirements. Now I want to talk a little bit about supply and demand, what we've been seeing in the market. So I've been trying to pull some data about how many farmers are actually participating. So I went out to some of the major companies who have programs. I tried to pull some of their data about how many farmers they actually have participating and how many credits. So these are either from their company websites or from news releases they've published. So Indigo has around 175 farmers participating initially. Now they have closer to 2,000 farmers at 5.5 million acres. Bayer has around 2,600 farmers in their program, but that's across 10 countries. So I don't know specifically how many they have participating in the US. Truterra has had over 1,900 farmers since 2016. And Nori has had about 15 farmers participating in their programs. So that's just to give you a snapshot. Like we talked about before, adoption rates are still pretty low based on some of the survey work that's been done. Now I want to talk a little bit about the supply and demand for credits. This comes from a report released by the USDA about the role of agriculture and forestry in the carbon market. So on the left, we have the carbon credits issued by year. We have both compliance and voluntary markets. So in a compliance market, there have been specific goals or standards set for emitters, and they either have to reach those goals by reducing their own emissions, buying credits from other emitters who are below their emissions goals, or buying carbon credits from an outside source. And then we have the voluntary carbon markets, which is what the agricultural carbon markets would be. That's the yellow bar here. So we can see that's a smaller market, but slowly growing from 2015 to 2022. And then we can further zoom in on that yellow bar, and that's the chart on the right. So if we look at the voluntary carbon credit market, we can break it out by forestry, agriculture, and land use credits. So we can see most of those credits are forestry credits. Part of the reason for that is the permanence of the forestry credits. That piece is a little bit easier. So when we're generating a forestry credit, we can guarantee that that's going to stay there longer. That's one of the challenges with the agricultural carbon credits. So part of the verification standards, a lot of the companies, you have to guarantee that the credit's going to stay there for so many years. But some of the agricultural credits are pretty easily reversible. So if we switch to no-till or reduced till for a few years, then all of a sudden maybe that land changes hands and the new landowner decides to till up the field, then basically we reverse all of the work that was done, and that carbon gets released back into the atmosphere. So it's a little bit harder to guarantee permanence with agriculture. That's been one of the challenges of these programs. But so the agriculture credits are this green bar here. And then we have a few land use credits being generated, which is this blue bar here. And then on the demand side, we don't have a lot of information, but there's been quite a few kind of high-profile news announcements that I found very interesting to watch. For example, in June, Indigo just announced that they'd sold 40,000 credits to Microsoft. So this is the highest recorded transaction of credits they've ever sold. So I think it's been interesting to see kind of that evolution, and some of these announcements we see coming out, I think could indicate tendencies toward increasing demand for agricultural carbon credits. Now I want to get a little bit into policy and funding and what we've seen from the government. The first thing I want to talk about is the USDA Climate Smart Commodities Program. So this basically, the government took money from the Commodity Credit Corporation, the CCC. They took $3.1 billion, and they opened up this Climate Smart Commodities Program, which was a competitive grant program to fund projects based on developing markets for climate smart commodities. So, and there's a lot of confusion about the word climate smart, like how do we actually define climate smart? So I don't get into that too much here, but I have a lot of good resources and information on that if anyone's interested on how the USDA defines climate smart, which is based on how the Food and Agriculture Organization defines climate smart and what kind of practices and programs we're talking about. So basically, they're trying to do research to develop climate smart commodities. Part of this research will help agricultural carbon markets because a lot of the problem with carbon markets is we don't have a lot of data and verification. So it's very expensive to do some of these on-the-ground verifications to see how much carbon is actually being stored in the soil from these practices. So companies have been using kind of a combination of modeling. So either some of them are using public models. So there's some publicly available models through universities. There's a couple of companies that have their own private models for how much carbon they think is being stored in the soil from these practices. And then they also use markers, which are like the amount of fertilizer you apply or other data from your farm. So they combine those with actual on-the-ground soil testing to some sort of combination of that they can use to kind of measure and see how much carbon is being stored. And then a lot of the programs pay based on the actual carbon storage. Some programs may pay you part of the money up front, or, there's adjustment after they actually measure. But so there's some sort of combination of those things using to measure. But with the modeling, it's very complicated and there's some error, and we don't have a lot of data on all of these practices. So part of the goal of this program is to get more data and better measurement of these practices. And that's part of the reason for the financial challenge of these markets is because the transaction cost of measuring this is so high. So when the transaction cost is high, and a lot of the cost of the credit is going to pay those transaction costs. So if we can lower the transaction costs, make this easier to measure, hopefully that can make the price maybe a little more interesting. So in South Dakota, we have 26 of these projects representing 43 commodities and 117 different practices. So this will definitely be something to watch as these practices evolve and they start publishing the results of their studies. And I should also mention that funding was unprecedented. There's never been another funding, especially in that way, using the CCC. Also, we have the policy side. So we have the Growing Climate Solutions Act. This was introduced in 2020. It was signed into law December 2022. There's not been as much information put out about this as I thought. So I'm still kind of waiting to see what happens with this. But basically, this defines the USDA's role as a kind of a manager of these carbon credit programs. So basically, they serve as a registry and a technical assistance provider to help farmers and landowners who are interested in participating. And then they'll host kind of a website with central information where kind of a one-stop shop where you can see all the companies that meet their certain requirements and their programs all in one place. So basically, their goal is to serve as a helper to implementing some of these programs and helping with the information and decision and making sure that these companies are actually doing what they say and we're measuring what they say they're going to measure. So they published a couple updates based on some of the policies passed. So on the left is their report to Congress about the role of agriculture and forestry in the U.S. carbon markets. So that's a really detailed, really nice report, contains a lot of information. It was released in October 2023. And then the report on the right was their justification report. So this is this is the outcome of the legislation I mentioned previously. So there's not as much information detailed in this report. It's pretty short, so hoping to get more updates and information on that soon. We've also seen some information put out by the White House. So this was just put out in May 2024. They put out kind of their standards for voluntary carbon markets, and some principles that the government's planning to follow, and also that they think that the buyers and sellers should follow when engaging with these voluntary carbon markets. So this is not specifically for agriculture, it's for voluntary carbon markets overall, and agriculture is just a piece of that. And this is not a policy or a law, so there's no requirements set in stone yet, but it gives us an idea to kind of what direction they're thinking of going and what future policies could come out of this. So basically, they outline 7 principles that state the specific requirements that credits would need to meet. So carbon credit, related to carbon credit integrity, related to not generating harm to others, saying that buyers need to focus on making the emissions reductions within their own supply chains. That's principle 3. Principle 4 is they want the buyers to publicly disclose the nature of the credits. So one of the problems with this market is that credits can vary in quality. So there's a lot of concern about that. There's concern that people could be double dipping, participating in 2 programs, and no one would know. So some of the verification programs ensure that this doesn't happen. There's a lot of different verification programs, and there's no standard or law that says what a company has to use. So this is recommending that companies need to disclose kind of some of the standards they're using. They need to make sure that the claims they're making are reflected in the credits, that we're making a real change, that they need to contribute to the market integrity, and that the buyers and sellers need to work together to lower transaction costs and facilitate participation. So I know that's a lot of information. What does that actually all mean for us, and what does that actually mean for agriculture? Well, these are the principles I think are most relevant for ag and most likely to affect agriculture carbon credit market. Number 1 is that the carbon credits generated have to meet certain standards. So this has been one criticism of some of the agricultural carbon credits, especially the ones that are being generated from past practices. We have to satisfy a principle called additionality, which means that a new change or a new practice is actually taking place. So if this standard were implemented or maybe put into law, then that would change the standards and the programs and what kind of rules they would allow for past participation. Another principle that could, if turned into policy, could affect things is that corporate buyers that use credits need to prioritize emissions within their own supply chain. So this could affect agriculture because there's a lot of companies using agricultural products, agricultural commodities. So this would mean they need to reduce specifically along their agricultural supply chain, which could create more demand for agricultural carbon credits. And another thing I want to mention is this policies could all change depending on the future policy environment and what happens. This is just the information we have right now. Another thing I want to mention is that there's been a lot of talk about expanding opportunities. A lot of agriculture industries outside of crops are looking for ways to get involved. So there's been some announcements about dairy farmer carbon credit programs. There's a lot of work being done with livestock production, livestock grazing. Some of that work's being done here in South Dakota with the Climate Smart Commodities program. So there's a lot of discussion about what other ways and opportunities that other agriculture producers can get involved. Because the programs we've seen right now have been mostly focused on crop farmers and very certain practices. And I've had a lot of farmers contacting me with very kind of creative projects they've come up with and trying to find ways to quantify some of that work they're doing. So I think there's still a lot of innovation happening in that space. So to kind of wrap everything up, there's been a lot of progress in investment since this all reemerged in 2020 and 2021. participation is still low on the farmer side. One thing I've learned from studying Alberta's agricultural carbon market and studying kind of the payments and the income generation there, it's important to keep in mind that this is not going to pay off the farm. So I think we shouldn't expect huge changes in the payment structure, but I think if the price increases and the transaction cost gets lowered, it could be enough to maybe get more interest in the programs. And it's important to also remember these programs are voluntary too. So I think there's a lot of concern about the programs from farmers, and I think it's important to remember that it's all voluntary, and it seems to be continuing in that voluntary direction for the near future. And a lot of the opportunities are still evolving and expanding, especially with all the research that's going on. Especially the policy side is taking a lot of time to evolve as they're putting out new information and reports. And I think it's important to keep in mind that future funding opportunities and policy changes could affect the direction of things. So then I have a couple of the slides, and then I'll wrap up. I'll share my contact information. That's my email. I can send you any of the information I put together. Happy to answer any questions too. I'll save some questions for the end so I can make sure that we save time for Tong's presentation, but happy to take questions at the end. Happy to answer questions in the chat, and happy to take questions by email and phone. So really interested in this topic and excited to see and keep putting out information in the next few years.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, for a very informative presentation. And let me start with mine. So like you said, we might want to save the questions to the end. Okay, so so my presentation today would be factors affecting carbon supply. This is more from the findings I did like 3 years ago from a Midwest farmer survey. So we did in 2021 summer. So some background, I think Sarah has mentioned lots of background here, and I won't go through in detail, but as we know that the greenhouse gas emission caused some climate challenges like the weather extremes. We have more than 120 countries has pledged to achieve the net zero carbon emissions by 2050 and 2060. So in order to meet those net zero carbon emission goal, so there is a demand for carbon credits, and it's expected to grow dramatically in the coming decades. And soil has been viewed as a frontier for the carbon removal. So therefore, climate smart practices has been believed to have the potential to sequester carbon. There is a growing number of carbon programs. They are designed to connect buyers with sellers and reward the farmers for adopting those different climate smart practices and provide them opportunity to receive carbon payments. So that's some brief background. And here you can see Sarah already mentioned there are different companies in the voluntary markets. So I just list some examples. And in this website I provide below, those actually are clickable, and we can see there are different policies for the farmers. And some essential steps involved in the carbon contract I list here as, there might be some slight differences, but the steps are essentially the same. So first, the farmer get enrolled in this carbon program, and then they change their practice. Here, this step, some of the programs allow some recently adopted practices as well, but most ask for the new practices. And then the soil is sampled before and after. They change a practice in order to quantify what's the carbon storage before and after. And then the carbon credit is quantified and verified, and then credit sold and farmer get paid. So those are some essential steps involved in a carbon contract. and some barriers on this carbon supply side, because the farmers are carbon suppliers, so they face some barriers. So some barriers, including the difficulties of quantifying the sequestered carbon. So there are some technical difficulties with quantifying this carbon storage. And another is the permanence of sequestered carbon, whether the carbon will stay there. And there are, in some areas, lack of solid scientific knowledge. And besides those technical concerns, there is economic concerns, which also a significant barrier for farmers to enroll in carbon programs. So economically, we know that if you adopt some new practices, always involves high equipment investment cost, like practice establishment cost, and some opportunity cost of learning. And also some programs require farmers to bear the measurement and verification cost of soil carbon. So that's additional cost. So therefore, sometimes people kind of refer the technical mitigation potential of carbon, but the economic mitigation potential is also very important because at different carbon prices, farmers want to supply different amount of carbon. So this is something we want to focus on based on our survey results. So this further confirms our hypothesis is the payment level offered is very important. And this is based on a 2021 survey in Purdue. 64% of farmers basically mentioned that the payment level offered is the most important reasons preventing them from enrolling in the carbon programs. The other reasons, including, for example, the skepticism of carbon sequestration viability, and some of them have used the eligible practices before, so which actually prevent them from enrolling in those programs. So here is a conceptual diagram showing how people would think when they face this decision. So they need to consider their cost and their benefit. So for this carbon program, the cost is, we can think about the potential cost involves the soil test cost, verification cost, those costs involved in the program. And then some new equipment cost if they are going to use some new practices. And there could be increased input cost. For example, if the farmers are using cover crops, then the purchase of cover crop seeds. And if they use no-till, they need to use more herbicide. For example, those kind of costs involved in the new practice. And then there are some learning cost and the benefit. The major part is the carbon payments. And then some co-benefits includes the yield increase from the crop side. If they change the practice, they might gradually see some benefits to the soil and to the crop yield. So the farmer make a decision based on whether the cost exceeds the benefit or benefit exceeds the cost. So we think that if the carbon payment is so low, so the benefit wouldn't cover the cost, the farmer answer is no, I wouldn't enter a carbon contract. However, if the carbon payment is high and the benefit exceeds the cost, then their answer is yes. And if in the range, they don't know, for example, they are not sure of certain things, I don't know how much my input will increase, and I don't know, how much my yield will increase. So there are certain ranges, they are not certain. So in that range, we would think that farmer will just think, I'm not sure. I have lots of uncertainties about the benefits and cost, so my answer is not sure. So this is our conceptual framework for the farmer thinking whether they want to enter a carbon contract or not. So in order to find out more, we did this survey in 2021, and so the survey was sent out to 6,000 farmers, and so we got more than 1,000 responses. the response rate is more than 20%. So you can see our survey region, we covered 4 states. So here, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, and Nebraska. So in South Dakota, we mainly covered East River of South Dakota, where the crop is mostly planted. So this is a clip of our survey questionnaire. You can see what we ask. So basically, we increase the carbon credit. So we first give them some background information. Okay, so if you manage your cropland well enough, you can get 1 ton of carbon per acre per year sequestered. And then we provide a list of carbon credit values and ask them whether they want to change their farm management practices in order to just get the carbon credit. So the value we provide, it ranges from 10, 20, 30, 40 to all the way to 70. So each of the price we give a no, not sure, and yes, so that they can choose. For each of them, they can only choose one choice, either no or not sure or yes. And here is our summary finding. So we found that if we give a $10 per ton this price, we can see that only 3% of farmers answered yes. And then increase to 20, this percentage increase very slowly to 4%, and $30 increase to 11%, all the way to 50% at $70, which is the highest price listed in our survey questionnaire. And in the meantime, we can see those people said no have decreased slightly, in the beginning, but then more fast in the end. So at $70 per ton, only 10% of farmers says no. So we can see that the farmers made a decision based on the benefit and cost principle. So if they see more benefit, they are more likely to say yes, but they see, like a low benefit, most people says no. So we can see that this price definitely play a role in their enrollment decisions. So we take a look at state by state. Because we surveyed 4 states, we try to find out whether there are differences across the 4 states. And I found like there is a much overlapping between those supply curve across the states. So basically the farmers in all Midwest states we surveyed, they show a similar pattern. So in the beginning, we increase the price, supply does not increase much, but in the middle range, we can see the supply increase a lot. And again, at the high price range, the 3 states, except the North Dakota, shows a slowed down response to the price offered. So we want to take a look at what is offered currently. So we took some prices from the companies who currently offer those programs, and we find out that some programs, they offer a price based on dollar per ton, some dollars per acre, but overall we found like the highest price the companies are willing to offer is about $30 per ton or per acre, so about $30. So if we think about our supply curve, we found out at the highest price offered at $30 per ton, then we found like only 11% of producers, they would likely to enroll in carbon programs and change their practices. If the current price more than doubles to $70 per ton, then we can see 50% of farmers, they are willing to change their practices. And then we found that there are some interesting curves there. So if the carbon prices are between certain ranges, for example, between $20 and $50 per ton, then the price incentives could be effective and successfully motivate some of the farmers to enroll their acres. However, at a very low range or very high prices, we found like price increase may not be a very effective method to increase the program enrollment. Okay, so another thing I found is these uncertainties. So we can see that even though we see those who said yes have increased a lot, those who have no decreased a lot, but those who have shown uncertainties basically remain mostly the same. So we take a look at this, and try to find out those people who answer uncertainties. So we found like these uncertain people, they are mostly the same group people. Like 30% of farmers, they answer not sure for all the prices provided. So which means, farmers, like almost 1/3 of producers have extreme uncertainty about those carbon market. So why they are uncertain? So we think about there are several reasons. One is the year-to-year changes in soil organic carbon. They remain uncertain. So the carbon measurement and verification and the different practices on a yearly basis is generally very difficult, expensive. And there could be some previously adopted practice. If farmers decide to discontinue it, it would release carbon from the soil. For example, if farmers have used no-till for some years, but then there is a wet year, they may decide to change back to the conventional tillage. That would affect their carbon storage. So this poses some risk to producers if they are under the carbon contract because they don't have the freedom to change back. If they change back to the conventional tillage, they will lose all the carbon credits. So we found out for the group of farmers who have higher uncertainties, most likely they have lower education, they have less more land, and they are small-scaled, and they perceived lower co-benefit from carbon farming. So they are more likely to have uncertainties. Okay, so based on our findings, we have the following recommendations in order to increase farmers' carbon supply. So first, based on our findings about the price and the farmer supply, percentage of farmer willing to supply carbon credits, we recommend that the farmers have to get higher gains from the carbon programs. So in order for the farmers to get higher benefits, this could be achieved by, first, the carbon prices could be increased to a level acceptable to a desirable percentage of farmers. For example, if we increase the carbon price from $30 to $70 per ton, then we can see the farmers willing to supply increase from 11% to 50%. And another thing is we can help farmers gain a better understanding of the co-benefits of the carbon programs. So the farmers now just get the benefits from the carbon payment, and they also get the benefits from the climate smart practices on their soil, yield, and profit. If there is proven evidence on those co-benefits, then the farmers could see more benefits, and the benefits are easily overweigh the cost. So in that way, they would like to increase the carbon supply. So that is the first recommendation. And the second, we think that the cost associated with the carbon market should be reduced. So we know there is a cost associated with new equipment, learning and measurement of carbon and verification. All those costs could pose barriers to adoption. So in that way, the either monetary subsidies to this market or technical support could help farmers reduce the cost and help them to find low barriers for the carbon program enrollment. And the third recommendation is based on our findings about uncertainty. So we found like nearly 1/3 of farmers, they show uncertainties across all the price levels we provided, no matter low price or high price. So we suggest that there should be techniques to reduce uncertainty and increase farmers' trust in the carbon market. So the lack of information about cost and the benefits of different programs, so that could pose a loss of uncertainty. So because farmers don't know, what's the exact benefit, what exact cost that's to me. So there are some difficulties in measuring and verifying the amount of carbon sequestration. That's something causes uncertainty as well. So therefore, it's important to establish consistent and transparent protocols for carbon measurement and verification. And also it's important to increase the availability and accessibility of educational materials to farmers, especially to the groups who express a higher level uncertainty. So because we have identified that the farmers who have, for example, lower education and small scale farms and least more land, they are more likely to have higher level uncertainty. So those people need more materials to help them make a decision. Okay, so that's my all my slides, and thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, feel free to let Sarah and I know so that we can answer your questions.